Hello and welcome to Sean White's Solar and Energy Storage Podcast. Today we have a very, very special guest, and his name is Jack West. And Jack is an inventor, but most of all, he's a musician because that's what Jack's been up to lately. He is kind of well known in the solar industry, or very well known in the solar industry, for starting and selling Zep Solar to SolarCity, and another company that he founded and sold over to NexTracker, which is now NextPower, which is Ojjo Solar. And by the way, too, SolarCity's not around anymore. That is called Tesla. You probably never heard of it, but you know, it was named after this guy named Nikola, I think. And so thanks a lot, Jack, for coming on. And one thing more that I wanted to mention is that we're going to be playing some of Jack's music in the background. And Jack is going to come to the NorCal Solar event on April 24th in Oakland, California. So get your plane reservations ready, and I expect to see all of you there. So thanks a lot, Jack.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So I've kind of followed you over the years. It's pretty impressive, the things that you've done. And a lot of it seems like inventing, and you've invented a lot of stuff. You've even invented something to do with guitars, I guess? I
have, yeah. You know, I like to invent things, whether it's songs or products, or, you know, I just have I have an approach to life that involves problem solving. And so I see problems and I become obsessed with them and I want to solve them. And, you know, songwriting is kind of like problem solving. You know, you have an idea initially and then you're like, okay, so where can I go with this? You know, and you're trying to solve this problem of like, how do I make the song work? And inventing products for me is kind of the same process. You have this idea and you think, okay, I wonder if you could mount solar panels this way, you know, and then you try to solve it, you know. And so music and solar have been the two kind of sides of my life professionally. They've always been in parallel. Admittedly, at times one or the other becomes a little bit larger, and certainly during the years at Zep Solar and Ojjo, the music career was a little bit more in the background, but never went away. And nowadays, the music is actually taken over the focus.
Awesome. Yeah, I remember seeing you play at one of the Solar Battle of the Bands, and was that the one that was at the Warfield Theater, or a different one?
I don't recall playing at the Warfield, so it was probably, what was that venue in Mezzanine we played?
Oh, Mezzanine. Okay, yeah.
I think, we did Mezzanine a couple of years, and there was one we did before that, but I don't remember the name of that venue. But yeah, I
used to see Jerry Garcia play over at the Warfield a bunch of times, so that was pretty cool. One thing I noticed too from your LinkedIn profile is you went to Humboldt State, and I was looking at those years there, and I was going to start the year before you started, it looks like. And I had a cold winter in Calaveras County, and I shifted state colleges and I went down to Long Beach.
Okay.
So otherwise we would have probably been best buddies, you know.
Oh wow, that's interesting. Wow. Interesting, almost crossing of paths there.
Yeah, and my brother went there, so I used to hang out up there, so who knows, maybe I saw you play guitar up there. Did you know a guy named Jason Hahn, who's a musician that was up there?
No.
But he was one of my brother's best friends, and he's a pretty good musician. He plays guitar and banjo and all that.
Oh, cool.
Anyway, just thought that would be kind of interesting if you knew some of Kevin White's friends. And so I remember too, up there at Humboldt, they had some kind of center that was like run on renewable energy before renewable energy was popular. Did you have anything to do with that?
Yeah, I mean, the reason why I got into solar was because of Humboldt. So I moved to Humboldt for completely random reasons. You know, I'm from Georgia originally.
Oh.
I'm from Savannah, Georgia. And after a couple years at University of Georgia, I found out that I could pay the same really low in-state Georgia fees and go to any school in this long list of schools. It was called the National Student Exchange Program. And I just kind of picked the furthest school from Georgia that I could find on the list. And that was Humboldt. No, absolutely nothing about it. It was totally random. I was actually a computer science major at the time in Georgia.
That's forward thinking.
And I got to Humboldt on the first day of classes when you go to sign up for your classes, and there was no computer science department. So I called Mom and I said, Mom, I think I'm going to change my major. And I just randomly signed up for a class called Whole Earth Engineering that Humboldt had, knowing nothing about it. And that was my introduction to solar. And that set my path. So it was for completely random reasons. And
have you been up there recently?
You know, not super recently, but the guy who was really my mentor, I don't know if you know Peter Lehman from the Schatz Energy Research Center up there, but Peter is really one of the true grandfathers of the solar industry in our country. He was doing solar, back in the 70s.
Wow.
And he was my mentor, and I took a lot of his classes, and that's who I really learned about solar from. And after I graduated, he invited me to participate in, he got into hydrogen and was doing a lot of hydrogen research, and then started the Schatz Energy Research Center up there. And then he invited me to join the board. So I actually sat on the board for many, many years until just recently. I just retired from that. But I would go up there. It was a great way to stay in touch with Humboldt and the university and stuff like that. So
yeah, I remember touring some building in the middle of campus. Is that the Energy Research Center that you're talking about?
Yeah, so there's kind of two, and I'm not sure which one you're referring to by your question, but there was two things going on. So the thing that I was involved in when I was a student there is called the Campus Center for Appropriate Technology. And that center was a student-run organization right on campus. And my project, actually, I was a director there 1 year, and the directors live in the building on campus.
Yeah, I remember that. Yeah.
And my project when I was the director there was it was called CCAT, to take the CCAT building off grid. So we had a big party, and we had faux scissors that we cut the cord to the grid with, and we installed a bunch of PV and batteries and stuff.
Oh, that's really
And the house
cool.
ran like off grid on campus for a long time, and then they eventually, when grid tie inverters got good enough, they eventually did a grid tied system. But next to CCAT, Peter created the Schatz Energy Research Center. So they're kind of both a part of the scene up there now.
And what does Schatz stand for?
Schatz is a guy who donated a lot of money to Peter to start the center. So he was a wealthy industrialist that funded it. Yeah.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
Well, cool.
Yeah.
So that's where you got your start over there in Humboldt. And yeah, I remember I was up there like hanging out there in the 80s and stuff, like the late 80s. So,
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, my band that I put together when I was up there, let's see, what years would that have been? So it would have been like 88, 89, 90, kind of that time period. Somewhere in there was when I was up at Humboldt. And I had a band called Omeya. So I don't know if you were ever up there and saw a band called Omeya. But
well, I probably do, and had such a great time I don't remember.
But yeah, so a lot of fond memories of Humboldt.
Yeah.
A lot of people think of Humboldt as being just like a weed capital, but it's actually, especially when I was there, it's really an activist community. I mean, people, having people like Peter Lehman up there, who's, like I say, one of the real founders of the solar industry in our country, and a lot of political activists. I got really into activism when I was up there. Got arrested at the Nevada nuclear test site and
Oh, wow.
all kinds of stuff. Yeah,
Good for you.
It's a
Put
very
that on your
very,
resume. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
So how did that go, getting arrested at the nuclear test site?
I was obviously at a protest protesting the testing of nuclear weapons out there. I don't know if you know about the Nevada nuclear test site, but
I've heard about it.
yeah, for many years, our government was testing nuclear weapons there, and yeah, I went out for a protest, and it was kind of a symbolic crossing of the cattle guard that is, the gate basically into the test site, that was led by the Native American Shoshone tribe whose land was stolen to test the nuclear bombs there. And so, led by these Native American leaders, a bunch of activists, we all went across the line and were thrown in jail. And I actually ended up, strangely, I landed in jail, which jail was basically a holding pen in the desert. I landed next to Wavy Gravy.
Oh, cool. I've met him a few times.
It was the saddest clown I've ever I've ever sat next to.
Yeah, so for people that don't know, he was the MC at Woodstock.
Exactly.
Back in 1969, and he's still around, I think, running around the California coast.
Yeah,
He is. Camp Winter Rainbow and all that kind of stuff. Yeah. He blessed my daughter, who's 30 now, by blowing the bubbles in the 4 directions.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. And then one time I was sitting next to him at Harbin Hot Springs, and
Yeah. No, he's a character. But yeah, I decided, after doing a lot of activism in my kind of college years, towards the end of my college years in Humboldt, I really realized that the more I learned about solar, I realized that my life was going to be focused more on solutions rather than getting arrested and, trying to be on the front lines of activism. I thought,
you didn't want to get 3 strikes.
Yeah, it's kind of like the fundamental problem here. Because, when I was at Humboldt, it was the first Gulf War. So, we put out a little periodical out of the CCAT house. So we put out a little newsletter thing, and I wrote a bunch of articles like no blood for oil kind of stuff. And, like during that whole period of the first Gulf War. And it was just like, wait a second, like, why are we killing people for oil? Let's figure the solar thing out. And that was really the big inspiration for me to go big in solar, was to try to figure out how to get humans off of fossil fuels, And so I really I took my activism passion and focused it on solar coming out of Humboldt. And that's when I moved down to the Bay Area after I graduated, and was bound and determined to figure out some way to make a living, because I wasn't making much of a living playing guitar. So I was determined to figure out a way to make a living in the PV industry, which was non-existent at that time. So that was kind of when I got started in
You saw
PV.
it coming.
Yeah.
Did you ever get involved in the Redwood summer protests up in Humboldt?
That was the Earth First scene, and I was only peripherally involved because a lot of Earth Firsters were involved. We were associated with the CCAT house. There was a lot of students and young people involved in that scene, but I was not an Earth Firster. I didn't climb trees and all that stuff. But I did go to a number of protests, and I was almost arrested at a Save the Headwaters Forest protest that was led by Earth First.
Oh, I might have been there with you.
Yeah, okay. You might have been
there.
there.
Like Bonnie Raitt got arrested, and I think there was like Mickey Hart was there, and a bunch of those people.
Some of those Headwaters protests were big. Yeah,
one of my neighbors here where I live in Canyon, California, in the East Bay. Her name's Karen Pickett, and she has an organization called the Bay Area Coalition for Headwaters. And she was feeding Julia Butterfly up in the tree sitter that stayed there for a couple of years, I guess.
Oh yeah.
Up in the big tree. All right. So you made it back down to the Bay Area. So and that's where you are now, I guess? Are you?
And there was a brief period of about a year and a half where I was in Santa Cruz playing music on the street in coffee shops and all that, and then and then made my way to the Bay Area, and I've been in and around the Bay Area pretty much ever since. There was a period where I moved up to Guerneville, so greater Bay Area, but still generally in the Bay Area. Yeah.
Okay. And when you were playing at coffee shops and stuff, is that before you made your big solar companies?
Oh yeah. No, this is when I was 22. Cool. So when I moved to the Bay Area, I got started, and I knocked on the doors of everyone that was doing solar thermal, because there was no PV industry at that time. And I knocked on, Gary Gerber, you
Sunlight and Power,
well, and a few other. There was only 2 or 3 other people, and I said, hey, I just moved to town. I'm interested in doing PV work. I wanted to know if you guys wanted to hire me to start like a PV department at your company. Because I didn't want to do hot water. And Gary said no. And then I ended up, the only person that said yes was Dwayne Campbell out in Concord, California, who had a little company called Solar Self-Help that was giving workshops on how to install solar hot water. And they kind of evolved into a contracting business that was doing solar hot water contracting. And so I hooked up with him, and he offered me $5 an hour.
All right.
And coming from playing on the street in Santa Cruz, I thought that was awesome.
Okay.
I said, great. I'll take it. So and I said, look, I'm not going to touch one pipe. Like, I'm doing solar electric. This is going to be I'm starting the PV division of this company. And he's like, he stuck to that. He never sent me out on one hot water job. And I just created, and I pretty quickly changed the name of the company, because I was like, this doesn't make sense. This is not you're not giving workshops anymore. Solar Self-Help is kind of an odd name for that business. And so I suggested that we change the name to Light Energy Systems. And so they stayed that for a number of years. I don't know if you ever heard of that company, but that company was out there for a long time.
I'm not sure. What are they still out there?
No, they sold eventually many years later, so it's no longer in existence. But so I started this little, kind of ragtag, PV division of this solar hot water contracting business out in Concord. And the ragtag organization was me initially for the first couple of years.
So I
sold the jobs, designed them, and installed them. I did everything. Dwayne gave me a truck, basically, and let me do my thing.
Yeah, a lot of times they said the old solar companies were 2 guys in a pickup truck, so you were one guy.
I was one guy in a pickup truck. Yeah, and eventually I built it up, and we had 5 or 6 guys by the time I left there, which was, I don't know, maybe 6 years later or something. But it was just in the early days. Most of the stuff we were doing was off grid, way out, and we would go out and find customers out in the Sonoma wilderness kind of areas, out in, even further than Concord. We'd do off-grid stuff, and we'd go to RV shows, I learned all the lingo. I could talk to all the old guys about their RVs and stuff. And then, because there was no grid tie inverters, hardly to speak of. Trace was just, I think during that period, Trace Engineering came out with the first proper grid tie inverter, And so we were just starting to do, and that was actually around Y2K. That was one of my favorite years in solar, was Y2K, because all of a sudden there was all this interest because the world was about to end. So there was all this interest in battery backup.
I hate it when the world ends. Yeah.
Yeah. So that was the first big wave of solar that I got to experience, which was really fun. So we sold a lot of PV with battery backup systems in 1999. So it was a bubble because as soon as the world didn't end, of course, no one was interested in those.
Did you run into Tom Chatagnier that was teaching all the classes at DVC?
No, actually.
I think
at least not that I remember the name, but...
Yeah, he was teaching, I think, probably almost as long ago as the 70s or something.
Oh, wow. Okay, so he's a true old-timer, yeah. I probably have met him, and I might have just forgotten his name.
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah.
Right.
Anyways, that was kind of my early days in solar. But that's how I learned about residential solar and a little bit of commercial. And then I left there, I ended up meeting who at the time was named Christina Manansala, who was a mechanical engineer that was starting to people were asking her to do solar consulting work, more solar engineering type of stuff. And she ended up hiring me to do a job, and long story short, 2 years later, we were a couple, and now we're married, and we're still married.
All right. Congratulations. That's why it says Christina West on the...
Yes. So Christina West is my wife, and she basically got me into solar consulting. So we started a little company called High Sun Engineering, and we did High Sun Engineering for basically the 2000s. So, around the late 90s, or maybe it was right around 2000. So yeah, so it was about a 10-year period from 2000, 2010-ish, something like that. Or 2009, actually. Yeah, we ended it because in 2009, I started Zep, actually. Yeah, and that kind of brings you up to stuff you probably know, which was the Zep years. But it was during those consulting years that I invented the technology that became Zep Solar.
Cool. All right.
In addition to this podcast being brought to you by Sean White's Solar and Energy Storage Podcast, it is brought to you by Intellectual Curiosity.
So a lot of people know Zep, but I'm sure there's a lot of people that don't because they might be doing utility scale solar or just started a little bit later in the industry. Mm-hmm. And Zep is, I guess you would call it a rail-less system. Mm-hmm. And it had this really neat groove in it. And so these different pieces would interlock in the groove, and it would put the PV up on the roof, and everybody was using it until SolarCity, which merged with Tesla, bought Zep up, and then not everybody was using it anymore.
Yeah. Do you want me to talk a little bit about Zep and kind of...
Yeah, that would be great. Yeah.
Okay, sure. Yeah, so what you said is correct. It was I kind of had this idea of getting rid of the rails because, having done a lot of the installations myself back in the day, I kind of had a lot of hands-on experience, and I had played around a little bit with some experiments, including on my own house, of ways of mounting them without rails. And so I ended up filing a patent on the idea, and I tried to license it initially way back in 2004, and no one was interested. And so I kind of just sat on it for a while. And then in 2008, we had started doing a lot of our clients as solar, me as a PV consulting engineer. We were really one of the first companies to really have that as a business model. And there was one other company, I think in Boston, a guy, what was his name? I can't remember his name right now. There was one other company that was doing kind of PV consulting work around that time. But we started getting kind of a who's who of the high net worth crew in the Bay Area, because during that period was when PV was still super expensive, but wealthier individuals that were concerned about the environment were starting to get interested in it. So, we had clients like Barry Bonds, and
all right.
And one of my clients was this guy called Tony Fadell, and Tony Fadell is super famous in Silicon Valley for being the guy who invented the iPod, and subsequently sold that to Apple, and then ran Apple's engineering department for a decade, developing the iPhone. So he led the iPhone development. So he's kind of the father of the iPod and the iPhone
Wow.
inside of Apple. So he's a heavyweight in Silicon Valley, or was. He's no longer in the Valley. But Tony was one of our clients, and so I was designing a PV system for him up at his house, and it turns out it was right when he was about to leave Apple, and I mentioned that I had an idea for a startup, and he said, "How can I help?" And I was just like, holy shit.
Okay.
Tony Fidel wants to help? Sure. Let's make this happen. So he really inspired me to raise some money and start the company. And when I had a real true entrepreneur that was interested, in helping me. So that's kind of how, raised a little bit of money from friends and family and kind of got it started. And I was able to go out to some of these high net worth clients of ours. And that's pretty much who I raised most of the money from initially. So it kind of worked out nice that we had this client base of wealthier individuals that were interested in what we were doing. And so that's how we got the company started. And we struggled for the first couple, 2 or 3 years. And then all of a sudden, SolarCity got interested. Actually, the first real break was when Vivint got interested. Vivint was our first big customer.
I remember that.
And then when they adopted it, and Vivint at that time was growing crazy fast. Tanguy Serra, who you may know, was running Vivint at the time, and Tanguy is just a fantastic business person, an amazing human being, and a good friend of mine. And Tanguy adopted Zep, and then SolarCity, they were looking in the rearview mirror, and they saw Vivint rapidly approaching them. And so they said, what is this technology they're using, And so we started talking to SolarCity, and then they became a customer, and then they started worrying that Vivint was going to buy us. And so it kind of became a race between Vivint and SolarCity as to who was going to buy us first, basically, because they were both worried that the other one was going to get us. And that's really what happened, So, but, it was one of those things where we beat our head against the wall for 2 or 3 years, and then we went from literally zero market share, really, to basically, like 50% market share in the space of about a year.
Amazing.
Yeah, it was great. Because SolarCity and Vivint were the two big dogs. And as soon as they both adopted us, and then a handful of the next tier were starting to adopt us as well. And so kind of all the biggest companies, they realized that there was a big savings there. Our main kind of marketing pitch at the time was that it was 5 times faster than the previous generation of technology. And we proved it by showing them videos, and SolarCity didn't just trust us, they went out and did the videos themselves. And they went from doing it took them 2 days per job. They went from 2 days per job to 2 jobs per day.
Wow.
At SolarCity, so it penciled. So that's kind of the story of that. And then, SolarCity bought us, and it was actually a fantastic acquisition. Like in the world of mergers and acquisitions, you hear a lot of nightmare stories where you get bought out and the new owner doesn't understand what you're doing and stuff, but it wasn't like that with SolarCity. They, the Rive brothers and Tanguy, who had left Vivint eventually and had actually gone over to SolarCity and was kind of the number 3 guy there. The management, Tanguy and the Rive brothers that were running it, their attitude was, what you guys are doing at Zep is magic. Just tell us how much money you need. As long as you save us a penny a watt per year, it's basically open checkbook. So it was fantastic. They hardly showed up on campus. We just kept doing our thing, and we grew from about 75 employees to about 150, and we had a blast inventing solar products, for 3 or 4 years until Tesla bought SolarCity. And then I lasted about a year, almost a year, working with Elon on, we would meet with Elon once a month and show him. Basically, I had this idea which became known as the Tesla solar roof. And I had pitched Elon on that idea. And my basic pitch was look, I think we should become really more of a roofing company. We should try to figure out how to really, come up with a way to make solar a good looking roof, someone should be walking their dog and see the neighbors, the Joneses got a new roof, it's a nice looking roof, and not even know it's solar. That was kind of my basic pitch at the time. And Elon loved the idea, so much so that he's basically stop everything you're doing. We had about 10 different products we were in the middle of developing. He wanted me to stop everything and just focus on the solar roof project. So he was the boss, so we did. And then we worked on that for what ended up being my last year involved. And it essentially ended by me and Elon having a pretty massive in very internally public disagreement in front of about 50 people about the direction for the product. So we had a big fight in front of everybody about which direction the product should go. And so, I basically said, I'm out because he's the boss. So it's like, dude, like, you're absolutely wrong. This is what we should do, kind of a thing. And he wanted to do what they did. And I think it's pretty clear who was right because the product has totally flopped in the market. But yeah, that's why I left. He's a hard guy to work with.
Yeah, you can read books about that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, he and I didn't get along that well.
Yeah, I was actually, somebody tried to hire me for they called it the solar glass. It's the current solar roof product that they have that I think it's just too expensive to pencil out.
That's pretty much what I told Elon.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I turned it down because I was like, I don't want to just go, change what I'm doing so I could go over there and get fired because Elon's having a bad day.
Yeah, exactly.
I read the book.
I had several meetings with Elon where he's like screaming in my face and all that stuff, just like the stuff you read about. Yeah, I experienced it firsthand. I got the spit in my face firsthand.
You got spit in your face. Wow. You can make a t-shirt that says Elon spit on me.
Yeah.
They used to have ones at the Dead concerts where it said Bobby spit on me. So.
But yeah, no, it was an interesting period. And then, I was happy to be out. And after that, I said to myself, you know what? All right, fine. I'm done with solar for a little while. I'm going to focus on playing guitar again. And then what ended up happening was like 3 months after I left Tesla, I had a dream of a new product. And
like a real dream.
I made the mistake of calling one of my top engineers, this guy Charles Almy. I don't know if you know Charles, but he's a well-known Bay Area solar guy. And Charles is a brilliant mechanical engineer. And I made the mistake of calling Charles and sharing this idea that came to me in a dream. And Charles made the mistake of telling me he liked the idea. So that ended up becoming Ojjo. So I had to put my music plans on hold again because I ended up telling Flan about it. So Daniel Flanagan, I don't know if you know Daniel Flanagan, but he was our co-founder at Zep. So my wife Christina and I and Daniel Flanagan were the ones that started Zep, and told Flan about it. And Flan said, I'm quitting Tesla tomorrow. And I said, wait a second. You've got like a wife and kids. And he's like, this is a good idea. Let's do it, man. So they basically, my team, we were a really tight group. And, the team, everyone was sick of it. Everyone wanted out. Everyone was sick of Elon. And so basically I grabbed, the core Zep team and we essentially reformed. We got the band back together, basically.
All right.
And did Ojjo. And so that ended up being... I was never fully working full-time there, but I helped get it started, and I was involved every day for the first couple of years. And then I kind of got more involved at the board level in the back half of Ojjo, so I could start to focus more on music. But yeah, so that was really fun. But the idea was, in a way, it was similar to Zep in the sense of how can we reduce materials and speed up installation, except if you apply that to the utility scale solar space. So it was how can we mount trackers, in a faster and more efficient way was the question. And the answer, it turned out, was a truss. So instead of doing just sticking an I-beam in the ground, which is, historical way that it was being done, I had this idea of a truss. And then basically using 2 ground screws to create the truss. So it was a complicated idea to realize, and I'm really glad that guys like Charles Almy, actually, who's a true mechanical engineer that actually understands machinery, got involved, because that's not my expertise at all. But a lot of the core guys, like another guy, Ty Hudson, and some of these guys are really great engineers, and they figured out and we designed and built this big machine that installs this stuff. And so, so we kind of got that going, and it turns out it cuts down the amount of steel about in half. So, and it's really the only, at least at the time, it was the only real way to put a foundation in at all on really hard soil. So we kind of went after the super hard soil market initially, and we learned a ton about soil. Just trying to figure out how to put things in the ground, So we spent a few years doing that and getting it all figured out, and then it turns out it worked. So we got going, and next thing you know, we were doing some huge jobs. We did our first gigawatt scale project that was about 1 gigawatt outside of Vegas, and that started going well. And,
that's huge.
Then NextTracker. I've known Shug for many, many years, of course. And
so that's Dan Sugar, another musician. Yeah.
Yes, true. Another musician, solar guy. There's a lot of us musicians in solar. But yeah, so Shug and I had been in communication pretty much almost since the beginning of Ojjo. You know, I'd said, hey, I have this idea. And so he's been keeping tabs on what we've been doing over the years. And so we were on about year 5, actually, when they proposed the idea of buying Ojjo. So yeah, so it was the right time. In my most ideal of worlds, I would have held on for another year because we were building it. We probably could have built an even higher valuation, but for a lot of complicated reasons that it's not worth going into, it was the right time to sell. And so we sold, and so the team is still at NextPower now. And as far as I know, I'm now out, so I'm not involved. So, but as far as I've heard through the grapevine, things are going well, and they're putting in a lot of Ojjo, which is great.
Great.
We interrupt you for a very important announcement. Shaun White's Solar and Energy Storage Podcast has been brought to you by Shaun White's Solar and Energy Storage Podcast. That's right, Shaun White is sponsoring his own podcast, and he wants to remind you to go check out some of his classes. You can go to SolarSEAN, that's Solar, SEAN.com, and then click on the links to check out his classes. You can check out his heat spring classes, and you can also hire him to teach classes for you, like at your company, something like that. Now back to the show.
With all these inventions, how would you recommend people, make their ideas happen? I imagine there's a whole lot of great ideas out there that nobody can make happen because they just, haven't figured out how to get the investors or just how to, make your idea happen without somebody stealing the idea.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I could talk about this topic for hours, but I'll try to give an abbreviated version. But you touched on 2 of the most important things, actually. I'm going to start with the second of those. So money and IP. So on the IP side of it, in many ways, I was extremely unlucky and extremely lucky to have had a competitor sue me on day 1 at Zep because I learned a ton about IP. And so basically what I learned was that patents aren't worth much of anything if you don't have a patent that's strong enough to withstand a lawsuit. The problem with intellectual property industry as an industry in the world of law is that patent attorneys are incentivized to get you a patent for as cheap as possible because most startup inventors don't have any money. And so most people go and they find a patent attorney and they get the patent attorney to write them a patent as cheaply as possible, and the patent sucks. And it just doesn't hold up in court at all. So that was the first big thing that I learned. And that was a learning that happened over several years, not the day I got sued. But Barry Cinnamon, I don't know if you remember the days of Akina Solar, but Barry's the guy that sued me.
Oh.
So Barry sued me claiming that...
You probably don't want to be on his podcast.
Does he have a podcast, or are you joking?
Yeah, he does.
He does, that's funny. Yeah, Barry sued me claiming that the Zep product was the same as the Akina product. It turns out that it wasn't, and I ended up winning. Effectively winning. We settled out of court. He kept suing me. He sued me like 3 times. And I sued him back in return once as a favor. But he claimed that it was the same, and I proved that it wasn't. And not only that, but through the patent office, I had to basically prove to the patent office that his patent claims were invalid. So I invalidated his patent. And on the other hand, my patent was actually essentially validated by the patent office. So through a very painful and incredibly expensive process. So I learned the hard way about IP, and luckily, I won and I was right. And so I survived. And then once you have like a bulletproof patent that is survived through a process like that, people like investors probably care about IP more than anybody.
So do you think that actually helped getting sued, like in surviving it?
In the end, yeah, absolutely.
So he did you a favor.
I haven't sent Barry any Christmas cards because let me tell you, it took 5 years off my life. But no, it definitely helped because, like I say, it kind of makes your IP bomb-proof, and and in fact, it did. Like everyone. After, Zep was successful, every single one of our competitors tried to copy us, but because we had such a fortress that they all had to take such a wide turn to get around our IP, that their products didn't succeed in the market. So none of the Zep kind of copy products succeeded, really, that I know of. I'd be happy to be corrected on that if someone knows of something.
That's pretty cool. So your first advice is to get sued on day one and turn lemons into lemonade. So.
Yeah. But if you don't want to get sued, what I do recommend is call a patent litigator. Don't just go to a patent guy that says he can get you a patent for as cheap as possible. Try to, ask around, find people that know how to litigate. So learn about patent lawsuits, because what you learn is you learn how to write claims for your patents that will hold up in court, because that's at the end of the day, all that matters in a patent is the claims. And so you have to have really, really good claims. And patent litigators understand that. They know how to make, claims that work in court. So that's a piece of advice. And like I was about to kind of go into, the people that care the most about patents are investors, because investors, they don't have any clue whether your idea is any good, really, and whether it's going to succeed. And, they don't have a whole lot to go on. So if you've got a patent, and you can say, hey, we own this real estate here, and we know a lot about patents, and we know a lot about patent litigation, and we can prove to you that no one can get around this patent, and this is going to be really solid, then they're more willing to open their wallet and invest in your idea. So I think that those are kind of two of the keys, and, going out for small amounts of money to friends and family is fine. That's what I did, and that's what everyone does. All my friends and family are very happy.
All right.
Of course, you got to be careful, because if you fall on your face, then all your friends and family's money went down the toilet, and you feel bad.
And then you'd be back on the street of Santa Cruz playing for nickels.
Exactly.
Looking for that $5
you could be in coffee
an hour
shops.
job.
But IP is really important, and I have to say, Shug, as anyone in solar knows, Shug is an incredible human being and a fantastic businessman, as well as a passionate, solar advocate on every level. But his business acumen means that he wouldn't have bought Ojjo if we didn't have good patents. Plain and simple. He would have been like, this is a cool idea, I'm just going to do something similar, right? And he would have basically just done it. But the fact of the matter is that we had good IP, and he couldn't get around us. So there's also just kind of a hard-nosed business reality to it, and if they can't get around you, then they got to buy you, And he told me that, when we sold, In fact, he actually hired my patent attorney.
All right.
He was impressed with our patent strategy, and so he wanted to include, that was a part of the acquisition in a sense.
And so you're probably, I guess, your most important patent is some new kind of guitar or something like that?
Yeah. So I have I have a lot of music patents too. I basically made my living as an inventor, and the solar inventions have actually admittedly made the real money. But I have a lot of music inventions. I invented a new type of finger picks actually, that basically they're kind of like prosthetic nails that make your nails like super strong. And that actually turned into a small company called Tiptonic. So anyone that's interested in that, you can go to tiptonic.com. My brother ran that for many years, and actually in the process now, my brother and I are in the process of selling it to another entity. So the company's temporarily on hold. You can't actually buy the product right now, but it'll be back in business soon. So there's that product. And then the one that I've been spending the most time on over the last 20 years on and off. So it hasn't been a consistent 20 years, but definitely the last 5 years, pretty steady, is a product that I call the Gliss guitar. Gliss as in bliss with a G. So Gliss, for people that aren't musicians, refers to glissando. So it's like barn, so it's the bending of notes, or the changing of the pitch. So it's basically an acoustic guitar that has a motor connected to every string. And the motors have the ability to change the pitch of the string in real time really fast. So you can go up to an octave in about 50 milliseconds, which musically is essentially instantaneous. So you can change the pitch of the strings really, really fast to get effects that have basically never been heard before.
And it keeps it in tune when you do that.
Yeah, a side effect of it is that it also the motors have the ability to, when you go to a new note, to make sure that note is in tune. But that's almost like a side effect of the real heart of the invention, which is how do you change the pitch of strings fast enough to be musical,
So you don't need to tune the guitar, or is it self-tuning?
So there actually is a manual tuning process still, because you still have to tune it initially. Don't think of it like, if you're familiar with what they call a closed loop servo algorithm, there's basically, in the world of servo motors, there's what's called closed loop and open loop. So a closed loop is where the loop is closed by some sensor that's, in this case, listening to the pitch and then telling the motor where to go. So we do have pitch detection, but we don't have a full closed loop system. So it's actually an open loop controller where the pitch detection is really just helping to inform an open loop servo motor control decision. So it's like, it kind of helps to calibrate. Think of it like a calibration component. So when it goes somewhere, in order to get there super fast, it can't be listening because the time constraints don't really work. So it has to know where it's going. So it's a really wild and incredibly complex. It's the hardest problem I've ever tried to solve.
All right.
As soon as you change the pitch of one string on a guitar, all the other strings go out of tune. So it's this kind of like bouncy house of changing intonation problems. It's a very complicated problem to solve, but it's been really fun. And the good news is that we're on what we call the V4 prototype now, and it's working. So we have, as of last Friday, we had one string on it and it was working, and we're in the process. It's a 6-string guitar, so we're in the process of, over the next month, putting the remaining strings on it and getting them all up and running. And in theory, unless we have a major roadblock, I should be recording and performing with this guitar by the end of the summer. So that's the current plan.
All right. Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. And from looking at some of your videos and the audio of your music that you're going to be playing at different locations, I think you were just at the Freight and Salvage, and it looks like you're going to Stanford, and of course the NorCal Solar Party. You've kind of invented a new style of playing guitar, perhaps? Like, guitar has always had a percussion element to it, but you've really taken it to the extreme, which is awesome.
Yeah, thanks. I'm glad you're enjoying the music. Yeah, I'm an inventor, so I can't help myself. I don't play guitar like other guitar players. I had to invent a new way of playing. And actually a lot of, especially lately, a lot of it is based on, I invented a new kind of thumb pick. So most people are familiar with, when you see like a banjo player or something, they have like a pick on their thumb, And so the thumb pick thing, they're not super comfortable and they're very limited in what you can do with a thumb pick. And so I was really into kind of banging on my guitar. I've done that for many years and I like to play percussively, but I came up with this idea for a thumb pick that would allow me to still be able to kind of, I call it the acoustic spank. So I can like spank the top of the guitar really hard with my thumb or my fingers. And if you had a normal thumb pick, A, that would really hurt, and B, the thumb pick would probably go flying off. So it's just kind of like a special thumb pick that allows me to play percussively with the thumb pick. And it also allows me to play both downstrokes and upstrokes with it. So I can play like really fast, like super fast kind of bass lines and stuff with it. And so it kind of opened up a new like musical universe, this thumb pick, and what I'm doing. And so as a way to explore the space, my first record that I did is this duo album that I just came out with this guy, Walter Strauss, who's also a fingerstyle acoustic guitar player. And so we just came out with this album, and we'll be playing a few songs from the album at the Solar meeting. And that's what we were performing at the Freight and Salvage recently. But yeah, the music is, I don't know, I mean, you probably have as good an idea as I do of the style, but it's somewhere between folk and rock and jazz, and it's all acoustic, but it's original. It's my own style.
It's awesome. Yeah, it's just like a whole new style of music. So yeah.
Cool.
Cool.
Wow, thanks, man.
Yeah. Well, let's see. Is there anything else that you want to talk about or that you think we should cover? You know what I was thinking too? Maybe you could, the Zep Groove.
Sure.
And so there's this groove that you have to get the PV module manufacturers to put on the frame of the module. Was that difficult to get manufacturers to go along with that?
That's a great question. And yes, that was the hardest part of the business model. When I first started Zep, most people told me that I was insane. Like, there's no way you can get a PV manufacturer to change their frame because it's a high volume product and it's a huge factory and it's really hard to make any changes, to such a high volume manufacturing line. And so that was the big challenge initially, was to get some PV manufacturers to do it. So the first initial customers that I had, I basically went over to China because that was where most of the PV manufacturing was and still largely is at the time. And so basically ringing doorbells at Chinese PV manufacturers to try to get them interested in what I was doing. The first company really that got me started on this whole path was actually Canadian Solar, who is, those of you listening who don't know, Canadian Solar is actually a Chinese company.
famous Chinese company.
Yeah.
Starts with a C. Canada, China, whatever, big difference.
Yeah. But yeah, essentially what ended up happening was I got my first licensing deal done. So what I was doing was I was licensing the Zep Groove technology to the PV manufacturers for, I think initially it was either free or really cheap. But basically the idea was to get them to just license my patent. And then we would, of course, sell the hardware that made with that to the solar contractors and wholesalers and whatnot. But the first licensing deal that I got done with a PV manufacturer was Canadian Solar, who at the time, the US office was headed up by Mike Miskovsky. I don't know if you know Mike, but Mike was running Canadian Solar in the US at the time. And the day after we signed that agreement, I called Mike back and I said, Mike, you totally kicked my ass on that negotiation. Can you just come be my CEO? And he said yes.
All right.
So, I was never the CEO of my companies. I always wanted to be the CTO because I'm more of the ideas guy, So Mike is a fantastic business guy and just a fantastic human being and a good friend. So Mike came on and Mike really helped, get other PV manufacturers interested. And, we went around and got, and it took us a while, but, eventually we had, I don't know, maybe 20 or 25 manufacturers that had all signed on. Pretty much most of the big manufacturers eventually signed on. And then we were also getting other companies like SolarEdge and stuff like that. They also became licensees because they started making technology that snapped into the Zep Groove. The whole idea was that the Groove was like the USB port of solar. I think that was one of our marketing lines back in the day. So it's sort of the idea of, this technology that allows a lot of people to participate, and make stuff.
So I guess Tesla's slowed down on the solar end of things.
As far as I know, and I'd love to be corrected on this because I don't keep close tabs, but the last time I checked, they're still selling Zep, actually.
Okay, cool.
Not in high quantities, but I think when they do a residential, if they're still doing residential, the last time I heard of, someone sent me a photo, I think within the last year, of a Zep system going in on a Tesla job. So I think they're still selling Zep. I would actually also be really interested if anyone knows what the longest lived product in the solar industry is, because we might be in the running. That product has been in the market since 2009. So, which if you think about it, like for an individual product with no changes, as far as I know, Tesla did not make one change to the Zep hardware. I think it still has the Zep logo on it and everything.
Oh, great, yeah. Huh. Yeah, I remember teaching people how to use it when I was working for Solar Universe.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, and I remember one of the tools that you had was called a rocket.
Yeah.
So was that so you could sell it to somebody that has rockets?
The rocket was, if I don't remember, guys, it's been a while, but I think the rocket was actually what was known as I thought it was the Zep fastener. I can't remember.
Okay. I'm sure you know better than I do.
Yeah, I think the Zep tool was the thing that installed the rocket. Actually.
Oh, installed the rocket. Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
I think that's the way it went. I think the rocket was the newer version of the.
Maybe that was that sold it. Where you're selling to a rocket person.
Well, the funny thing is that most of our products, like what we would do internally when we were coming up with, over that period of time, we probably invented, I don't know, maybe 30 products or something. My name is actually on over 100 patents, most of which were from that period. And we basically had this open checkbook from SolarCity to invent things. So we were inventing all kinds of stuff. But, our thing was, as soon as we would start to work on a product, we'd get together, a team of engineers to work on it. And then we'd come up with a name for the product. And our system was kind of like a hurricane naming system that would go alphabetically, but it was by rock stars. So we had like a Stevie Wonder, Stevie Ray Vaughan. I think we did 2 Stevies in a row. We had a Michael Jackson. We had so it was like, all these products. And the product actually that I got in the big fight with Elon about was actually called Steel Pulse. It's a very obscure British reggae band, Steel Pulse.
Yeah, I know, yeah.
And Steel Pulse was the famous product. And it was actually mentioned in a Fast Company article they had found. That sort of leaked out that our code name was Steel Pulse. So that kind of added color to the story during that period when Elon was getting sued for the buyout. I don't know if you remember hearing about that, but there was a lawsuit saying that he was just buying his cousins out, to keep him from going bankrupt and all this stuff. And,
sure, yeah.
Yeah, but there was some...
It was like shareholders didn't want him bailing out SolarCity or something.
Yeah, there was like a bailout lawsuit. Yeah, during that time, there was some articles, and they referred to Steel Pulse in the articles. I got a kick out of that. I don't know if the band ever found out. But
So what was the Steel Pulse?
What was still possible? My idea, which Elon didn't want to do eventually, what the idea that, that we got in the arguments about. But basically the idea is just that it was a way of doing a metal roof instead of if you're going to do a solar roof, the question is, what kind of roof is it? Elon wanted to do tiles, which is what they did. And I was like, we should do something that's bigger panels, that we can do larger scale so we can make it cost effective. And so I wanted to do this thing that was like a metal roof concept. And so we had invented a way to do a PV metal roof that looked indistinguishable from a metal roof. So it just looked like a roof. You couldn't tell it was PV. So that was the idea.
And what kind of metal roof did it look like? Was it?
And the market we wanted to go after was the re-roof market. Because we were like, the idea was, well, wait a second. We don't have to do the metal roof market per se. Let's just throw these things on top of comp. And that was kind of the basic idea.
Well, anyway, like solar cells kind of work better at a certain color. Would be like more black or black with some blue in it.
Yeah. I mean, it could be tinted without a lot of loss, though. The color is flexible somewhat. But yeah, I have to say I'm very, very happy with the way the solar industry's evolved, and I had a really fun run. And I'm still always a little bit involved here and there. But at the moment, I'm largely focusing on music, and I'm actually working on a new album project that just came out with my last album. So I've got another album that I'm working on. I've got a recording session. Anyone who's into music might know the name Mike Marshall, a mandolinist that used to play with David Grisman. That is probably bigger than people might have heard.
Yeah, I definitely know David Grisman. I've seen him play at the Warfield.
Second David Grisman album had two mandolin players, David and Mike Marshall. So Mike's kind of an old school guy from that era of the great David Grisman world. But Mike and I are going to do some recording this summer on this new record that I'm working on. And so, yeah, I'm kind of that project, because Mike is sort of a bluegrass, more on the bluegrass side of things, it'll end up being a little bit more of that. But, me kind of doing my thing, I'm actually calling it, because as I mentioned, I call my technique, the acoustic spank techniques. I'm tentatively titling my new album Spank Grass.
All right, Spank Grass. All right. Cool.
So that's what I'm working on now.
All right. Well, I can't wait to hear it. And then what's the website where people can see all your music? And
Yeah, thanks for asking. Yeah, so if you go to jackwestguitar.com or just go onto any of the social media, Facebook and Instagram and YouTube, I'm just at Jack West Guitar. So it's always just Jack West Guitar.
Great.
Is kind of my handle, and yeah, you can check out the music. We actually have a lot of videos. So one of the things I did after we sold Zep, I started working on building my own recording studio. So I now I have essentially a live workspace. You're actually seeing me right now in one of the 5 rooms of my recording studio, even though it looks like a couch behind me. This particular room kind of doubles as my office, and it's also an ISO booth for a recording studio. So I'm really into recording both audio and video. So pretty much everything I do, we do like live in the studio videos and stuff like that. So all my music, every song that I'm doing now has a video. So you can go to my YouTube channel and check out lots of videos and stuff. So.
Great. Okay, so what song should we end this podcast with?
Wow, good
You want
question.
to introduce a song? Yeah.
Actually, why don't we do Youth?
Youth. Okay.
Youth. The song Youth, because Youth, it starts with me kind of doing the percussive thing a little bit more obviously. So since we've been talking about that, the acoustic spank the song starts with that. So that tie into what we were talking about. So I would do the song Youth. Yeah.
Great. Well, that was an introduction to the song Youth by Jack West. Check out Jack West Guitar and jackwestguitar.com, or on any kind of social media. Check out SolarSEAN.com. Get yourself NABCEP certified. And thanks so much, Jack, for having this great conversation. Hopefully, maybe we could do it again someday.
Sounds great. It's been a blast. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and I look forward to seeing you play guitar and give a little talk at the NorCal Solar event, which is part of SF Climate Week, and that's going to be over in Oakland. And you can find out more about that at norcalsolar.org, and that's going to be on April 24th in the evening. So thanks a lot, Jack.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. This is fun.
Woo!